In the deep silence of a northern night, where stars pierce through the darkness like ancient eyes watching over forgotten realms, we find ourselves drawn to stories that have echoed through time itself. The aurora dances overhead, painting the sky in ethereal greens and blues, as if the very heavens are telling tales of gods and monsters, of heroes and tricksters, who once walked between worlds. Here, beneath this celestial tapestry, lies the heart of Norse mythology, where the great world tree Yggdrasil stretches its branches across 9 realms, its roots drinking from wells of wisdom and fate. In the highest of these realms stands Asgard, the shining fortress of the gods, where golden halls gleam with eternal light, and the sound of mead horns echoes through corridors built for immortals. Within these sacred walls dwell the Geir, the gods who shaped destiny and govern the forces of nature. Odin the Allfather sits upon his high throne, his ravens whispering secrets from across the 9 worlds, while Thor's hammer rings against the anvil of thunder. Frigg weaves the threads of fate with gentle hands, and Baldr shines with a light so pure that darkness itself recoils from his presence. Yet among these divine beings walks one whose very existence challenges the nature of godhood itself, a figure both beautiful and terrible, wise and foolish, beloved and despised. His name is Loki, and his story is perhaps the most complex and haunting of all the tales that drift down to us from the frozen north. If you find yourself drawn to these ancient whispers, to the shadows that dance at the edges of divine light, then settle in for a journey that will take you deep into the heart of Norse darkness. Like the northern winds that carry both the scent of pine and the chill of coming winter, Loki's tale brings with it both wonder and warning, laughter and sorrow, intertwined like serpents around the roots of Yggdrasil. How is it that one being could embody such contradictions, serving as both the gods' greatest ally and their ultimate destroyer? What forces shaped this shapeshifter, who could appear as man or woman, wolf or salmon, whose silver tongue could weave lies as beautiful as any truth? And why do his stories, among all the myths of the North, carry within them such profound darkness that they continue to haunt us even now, centuries after the last believer offered sacrifices beneath the dying light of Ragnarok? The answers lie not in simple tales of good and evil, but in something far more complex and unsettling. For Loki represents something that exists within the very fabric of existence itself. The shadow that gives meaning to light, the chaos that makes order precious, the laughter that rings hollow in the face of inevitable doom. He is the trickster god whose tricks ultimately trick only himself, the firebringer whose flames consume both enemy and friend, the father whose children will devour the world he helped to build. As the night deepens around us, and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, we begin to glimpse the truth that the Norse understood so well, that within every act of creation lies the seed of destruction, within every moment of joy the potential for sorrow, and within every heart the capacity for both love and betrayal. Loki's story is not merely the tale of one god's fall from grace, but a mirror held up to the fundamental nature of existence itself, where light and shadow dance together in an eternal embrace that will continue until the very end of time. The wind carries with it the scent of pine and snow, of distant fires, and the salt spray of northern seas. In this liminal space between waking and dreaming, between the mortal world and the realm of gods, we prepare to walk alongside the most enigmatic figure in all of Norse mythology. The trickster waits in the shadows between stars, his smile both inviting and dangerous, his eyes holding secrets that mortals were never meant to know. Born of fire and trickery. In the beginning, before the first trick was played or the first lie was told with honeyed words, there was only the vast emptiness of Ginnungagap, the yawning void that stretched between the realms of ice and fire. It was from this primordial chaos that all things emerged, including the complex tapestry of relationships that would bind gods and giants in an eternal dance of alliance and enmity. The giants, those ancient beings of immense power and primal wisdom, were not always the enemies of the gods that later tales would make them seem. In the early days of creation, when the boundaries between order and chaos were still fluid and uncertain, marriages and alliances were formed that would echo through all the ages to come. It was from one such union that our story truly begins, whose name whispers of dangerous strikes and sudden violence, was a giant of considerable cunning and power. His very essence embodied the unpredictable force of lightning, the crack of thunder that splits the sky without warning. To him came Loki, sometimes called a figure shrouded in mystery, whose name speaks of leaves and needles, of the delicate things that bend before the storm, but somehow survive its fury. Some say she was a goddess, others that she too was of giant blood. But all agree that from their union came something unprecedented in the 9 realms. The child born of this coupling was unlike any being that had walked the paths between worlds, where other children of giants grew massive and crude, wielding strength like a blunt instrument. This child was slight and graceful, possessed of an intelligence so sharp it seemed to cut through reality itself. His eyes held the flickering warmth of hearthfires and the destructive hunger of wildfire in equal measure. And when he smiled, those who saw it felt both drawn to him and subtly warned away. They called him Loki, though the true meaning of his name remains as elusive as the god himself. Some say it speaks of locks and closures, of doors both opened and barred, while others hear in it the crackle of flames or the sound of spider-thin threads being woven into an invisible web. Perhaps all of these meanings are true, for Loki would prove to be all of these things, and more, a living contradiction wrapped in flesh that could change its very nature at will. From his earliest days, it became clear that Loki possessed gifts that set him apart from both giants and gods. The art of shapeshifting came to him as naturally as breathing, and he could assume any form that pleased him or served his purposes. One moment he might appear as a handsome youth with fire-bright hair and mischief dancing in his green eyes, the next as a wizened crone bent with age and wisdom, or as any of 1,000 different animals, each transformation so perfect that even Odin's all-seeing gaze might be deceived. But it was not merely his physical form that Loki could alter at will. His voice, too, was an instrument of infinite variety, capable of producing sounds that could charm the birds from the trees, or convince the wisest sage to act the fool. He could speak with the honey-smooth tones of a practiced seducer, the authoritative boom of a war chief, or the gentle whisper of a mother singing her child to sleep. Each voice was perfectly crafted for its intended purpose, and none who heard him could doubt the sincerity of his words, even when those words were lies wrapped in silk and shadow. It was this gift for deception, combined with an intelligence that seemed to operate on levels beyond mortal comprehension, that first brought Loki to the attention of the gods of Asgard. In those early days, when the walls of their great fortress were still being built and the hierarchy of divine power was not yet firmly established, the gods found themselves in need of allies who could navigate the complex web of relationships that bound the 9 realms together. Odin, the All-Father, whose wisdom was earned through sacrifice and suffering, recognized in Loki a kindred spirit, another seeker of knowledge, who was willing to pay whatever price was demanded for understanding. The two formed a bond that went beyond mere friendship or alliance, swearing oaths of brotherhood that would bind them together through all the ages to come, even unto the end of the world itself. Some whisper that this oath was sealed with blood, that Odin and Loki cut their palms and let their life essence mingle, creating a connection that could never be severed by death or betrayal. Others say that they shared the sacred mead of poetry, drinking from the same horn until their thoughts became intertwined like the roots of Yggdrasil, each understanding the other's mind as clearly as his own. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound than either of these tales suggests, that two lonely beings, each carrying within him the burden of seeing too clearly into the nature of existence, found in each other the only companion who could truly understand the weight of such knowledge. Under Odin's protection and with his blessing, Loki walked freely through the halls of Asgard, his silver tongue earning him friends, and his quick wit making him a valuable counselor in times of crisis. The other gods, while perhaps never fully trusting this child of giants who moved among them like a fox in a henhouse, came to rely upon his cunning and his ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. Yet even in these early days, when Loki's tricks were merely playful and his lies were told more for amusement than malice, there were those who sensed something darker lurking beneath his charming exterior. Heimdall, the watchman whose sight could pierce through all deceptions, regarded the trickster with eyes that held both wariness and a strange sort of pity, as if he could see the threads of fate that bound Loki to a destiny too terrible to speak aloud. For already the seeds of Loki's downfall were being sown, not by external enemies or cosmic forces beyond his control, but by the very nature that made him who he was. His need to prove his cleverness, his inability to resist the perfect setup for a joke or scheme, his deep-seated resentment at being forever the outsider, looking in at a family that had adopted him, but never truly accepted him as one of their own. All of these traits were there from the beginning, waiting like embers that needed only the right wind to burst into consuming flame. As the years passed and Loki's reputation for mischief grew, the gods began to see him as both blessing and curse, a necessary evil whose presence brought both solutions and problems in equal measure. They laughed at his jokes, even as they wondered what price they might eventually pay for his friendship, and they welcomed his counsel, even as they watched him with eyes that held the wariness of those who know they are living with a predator whose hunger they cannot fully understand. The god who could not be trusted, the great halls of Asgard, rang with laughter in those days, a sound both golden and brittle, like the chiming of bells made from ice that might shatter at any moment. For Loki had made himself the entertainer of the gods, the jester whose wit could turn the darkest mood to merriment, and whose stories could make even grim Odin crack a smile. Yet beneath the laughter lay an undercurrent of unease, for the gods were beginning to learn that Loki's gifts came with a price that was not always apparent until the bill came due. It began, as many of Loki's schemes did, with what seemed like harmless mischief. Sif, the golden-haired wife of Thor, was known throughout the 9 realms for her beauty, and chief among her glories was her magnificent hair that flowed like ripened wheat in summer sunlight. It was said that when she walked through the fields of Asgard, the grain would grow taller and richer, drawn by the radiance of her locks that seemed to hold within them all the warmth and abundance of the harvest season. But Loki, perhaps driven by some impulse he could not name or would not acknowledge, crept into her chambers while she slept, and with a blade sharp as winter's edge cut away all that golden glory, leaving her head bare as a newborn's. When Sif awakened and discovered what had been done to her, her cries of anguish echoed through Asgard like the wail of the wind through barren fields, and Thor's rage shook the very foundations of the realm. The thunder god's fury was a terrible thing to behold, his hammer crackling with lightning as he sought out the culprit. When he found Loki, still smirking at his own cleverness, Thor's words were few but weighted with the promise of violence that would make the destruction of frost giants seem like child's play. "Fix this," he commanded, "or face the consequences of awakening a storm that would not easily be calmed." And so Loki, faced with the prospect of experiencing firsthand just how effective Mjolnir could be as an instrument of divine justice, used his silver tongue and cunning mind to solve the problem he had created. He traveled to Alfheim, the realm of the Light Elves, and sought out the master craftsman, whose skill with precious metals was legendary even among the gods. With promises and threats, with bargains and bribes, he convinced them to create for Sif new hair spun from the finest gold, more beautiful than what she had lost and possessed of magical properties that would make her even more glorious than before. When Sif donned this new crown of golden threads, she found that it was indeed more beautiful than her original hair, and that it grew and moved as if it were alive, responding to her emotions and the changing seasons. Thor's anger cooled to a simmer, and the crisis seemed to have passed. But those who watched closely noted that Loki's solution, while effective, had not been born of remorse for his actions, but rather from fear of punishment, and they wondered what other mischief he might work when he felt safe from retaliation. The pattern was established, and it would repeat itself with variations throughout the years that followed. Loki would create problems through his tricks and schemes, then solve them in ways that often left him appearing as a hero, while subtly making the situation worse than it had been before. His solutions were like patches on a garment that was slowly unraveling, each fix creating new weak points that would eventually give way under pressure. There was the time he convinced the gods to make a wager with a giant who claimed he could build an impregnable wall around Asgard in exchange for the sun, the moon, and the hand of Freya in marriage. The gods, certain that no single being could complete such a massive undertaking in the time allotted, agreed to the bargain, thinking they would get their wall for free. But the giant had a stallion of supernatural strength and speed, and as the deadline approached, it became clear that he would indeed finish the work. Faced with the prospect of losing the light of the world and the most beautiful of the goddesses, the gods turned to Loki for a solution. With typical cunning, he transformed himself into a mare and led the giant's stallion away at the crucial moment, causing the builder to fail in his task. The gods kept their sun and moon, and Freya remained in Asgard. But the giant's death at Thor's hands created enemies among his kin, and Loki's time as a mare resulted in consequences that would echo through the ages. For from that union came an 8-legged foal, that would grow to become Sleipnir, Odin's supernatural steed. Each of these incidents left the gods more wary of their trickster companion, yet they could not deny that his solutions, however morally questionable, were often effective. When diplomacy failed and strength was insufficient, Loki's cunning could find a way forward, albeit one that often led through shadows and moral ambiguity. He became indispensable to them, even as he became impossible to trust, a contradiction that would define their relationship until the very end. The other gods learned to read the signs of Loki's mischief, the telltale glint in his eye that preceded some elaborate scheme, the tunascent smile that suggested he was already several moves ahead in a game whose rules only he fully understood. They began to watch him more carefully, noting the way he seemed to take particular pleasure in exposing the weaknesses and hypocrisies of those around him, as if he were conducting some grand experiment to see just how far he could push before something irreparable broke. Baldr, the shining god of light and joy, was perhaps the only one who never seemed to fear Loki or suspect him of hidden malice. His pure heart saw only the best in everyone, and he would often defend the trickster when others spoke against him, arguing that Loki's methods might be questionable, but his loyalty to Asgard was beyond doubt. This faith would prove to be both touching and tragically misplaced, for Baldr's very goodness made him blind to the darkness that was slowly consuming his would-be protector. As the years passed, Loki's tricks grew more elaborate, and their consequences more far-reaching. What had begun as simple pranks evolved into complex webs of deception that sometimes took months or even years to fully unravel. He would plant seeds of discord with casual comments, arrange seemingly accidental encounters that led to misunderstandings, and create situations where the gods were forced to act against their better judgment, all while maintaining his facade of helpful concern. The transformation was so gradual that it was easy to miss, like watching a friend slowly succumb to a wasting disease. Each individual incident could be explained away, each trick rationalized as harmless fun or necessary mischief, but taken together they painted a picture of someone whose relationship with truth and loyalty was becoming increasingly strained. The laughter in Asgard's halls began to sound more forced, the smiles more brittle, as the gods found themselves wondering not if Loki would betray them, but when and how severely. Yet still they kept him close, bound by oaths and old affection, by need and by the terrible knowledge that driving him away might create an enemy far more dangerous than any foe they had yet faced. For Loki knew all their secrets, all their weaknesses, and his mind was quick enough to turn any advantage they thought they possessed into a weapon that could be used against them. They were trapped in a dance with a partner whose steps grew more unpredictable with each passing season, unable to break away without risking a fall that might destroy them all. Deals with dwarves and the price of tricks. In the deepest caverns beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, where the light of sun and moon never penetrates, and the only illumination comes from forge fires that have burned since the beginning of time, dwelled the master craftsmen of the 9 realms. The dwarves, those beings of stone and flame, whose stubby fingers can coax miracles from metal, and whose understanding of the fundamental forces that bind reality together surpasses even that of the gods themselves. It was to these dark halls that Loki descended when his latest scheme had created problems that required solutions beyond the reach of ordinary cunning. The incident with Sif's hair had shown him the power that lay in the dwarves' craft, and he had not forgotten the lesson. But dealing with these ancient beings was never simple, for they remembered every slight, every broken promise, every debt left unpaid, and their memories stretched back to the very foundations of the world. The sons of Uvaldi, master smiths, whose workshop echoed with the rhythm of hammers on supernatural metals, greeted Loki with the wary courtesy they showed to all customers whose reputations preceded them. They knew the trickster's nature, had heard the tales of his silver tongue and shifting loyalties, but they also knew that he brought with him opportunities for craft that challenged their skills and expanded their understanding of what was possible to achieve. The commission he placed before them was ambitious, even by their standards. Not content with simple replacements or repairs, Loki sought treasures that would surpass anything yet created gifts, so magnificent that they would secure his position among the gods forever and demonstrate once and for all the value of keeping him as an ally rather than driving him away as an enemy. The first item he requested was a replacement for Sif's shorn locks, but one that would be more beautiful than what nature had originally provided. The dwarves accepted this challenge readily enough, for they had long sought to prove that their craft could improve upon even the gods' own perfection. From the finest threads of spun gold, they wove hair so lustrous and alive that it seemed to hold captured sunlight within each strand. Hair that would grow and change with its wearer's moods, and would never lose its divine radiance. But Loki's ambitions did not stop there. He commissioned a ship for Freyr, the god of prosperity and fertility, one that could sail through air as easily as water, that could be folded up and carried in a pocket when not needed yet, could hold all the gods of Asgard when unfurled. The dwarves crafted Skidbladnir with sails that caught winds from other realms, and a hull that could navigate the currents of time itself, a vessel so perfect that it would always have favorable weather and would never be wrecked upon any shore. The third treasure was perhaps the most ambitious of all, a spear for Odin that would never miss its target and could pierce any armor, no matter how strong or how blessed. Gungnir emerged from their forges wreathed in runes of power, its point sharp enough to cut through the very fabric of fate itself. Its shaft carved from wood taken from Yggdrasil's own branches and inscribed with words that held the power of absolute command. When the sons of Ivaldi presented these wonders to Loki, he praised their skill with words honeyed enough to sweeten the bitterest draught. But his praise carried within it seeds of future trouble, for he could not resist suggesting that while their work was indeed magnificent, there might be others whose skill was even greater. Smiths who could craft treasures that would make these pale by comparison. The dwarves' pride, as deep and unyielding as the mountains they called home, was stung by this casual dismissal of their greatest achievements. They demanded to know who Loki thought could surpass their craft, and with a smile that held both innocence and malice, he mentioned the brothers Brokkr and Eitri, smiths whose workshop lay in another part of the mountain realm, and whose reputation for innovative techniques had begun to rival that of the sons of Uvaldi. What followed was a competition that would test the very limits of dwarven skill and magical craftsmanship. The brothers, insulted by the suggestion that the sons of Uvaldi's work surpassed their own, agreed to create 3 treasures that would prove their superiority. But they demanded something in return for their efforts, something that would make the risk of failure too terrible to contemplate. Loki, confident in his ability to talk his way out of any difficulty, agreed to wager his own head against their success. If they could not create treasures superior to those already made, they would owe him a debt that could never be repaid. But if they succeeded, they would have the right to take his head as payment for their labor. It was a bargain that revealed much about Loki's nature. His absolute confidence in his own cleverness, combined with a reckless disregard for consequences that bordered on the suicidal. Brokkr and Eitri set to work with grim determination, their hammers ringing in rhythms that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the earth. First, they crafted Gulenburst, a boar with bristles of pure gold that could run through air and water faster than any horse, and whose radiance could light up the darkest night. This they gave to Freyr as a companion and mount worthy of a god of fertility and abundance. Next came Draupnir, a ring of such perfect proportions and magical properties that it would create 8 identical copies of itself every 9th night, ensuring that its wearer would never lack for wealth or the means to reward loyalty. This treasure was crafted for Odin, adding to his already impressive collection of magical artifacts and cementing his position as the wealthiest of the gods. But their masterpiece was saved for last. A hammer forged for Thor that would never miss its target, would never break no matter how hard it was used, and would always return to its wielder's hand after being thrown. Mjolnir emerged from their forge with a handle slightly shorter than intended, for Loki, desperate to disrupt their work, had transformed himself into a fly and stung Eitri's eye at the crucial moment of its creation. Yet even this flaw could not diminish the weapon's power, and some said it made the hammer even more distinctive and easier to wield in the heat of battle. When the gods gathered to judge between the 2 sets of treasures, there could be no question of the outcome. While the sons of Ivaldi had created objects of great beauty and utility, Brokkr and Eitri had crafted items that would fundamentally change the balance of power in the 9 realms. Thor's hammer alone was worth more than all the other treasures combined, for it gave the thunder god the ability to protect Asgard from any threat and made him the most formidable warrior in existence. Faced with the prospect of losing his head to pay his debt, Loki's silver tongue worked overtime to find a loophole in the agreement. He argued that while the dwarves had won the right to his head, they had no claim to his neck, and since it would be impossible to separate one from the other without damaging both, the debt could not be collected. It was logic born of desperation and sophistry, but it was clever enough to give the dwarves pause. Frustrated by this verbal trickery, but unwilling to break the strict letter of their agreement, Brokkr and Eitri chose a different form of payment. They sewed Loki's lips together with magical thread, silencing his silver tongue and serving. Notice that future deals with the dwarves would require more honest negotiation. The stitches eventually dissolved, but the humiliation remained. A reminder that even Loki's cleverness had its limits, and that some debts could not be talked away. The incident marked a turning point in Loki's relationship with both the gods and the other inhabitants of the 9 realms. His willingness to risk everything on a single wager, his casual dismissal of others' achievements, and his attempts to weasel out of legitimate debts painted a picture of someone whose character was fundamentally flawed. The gods began to realize that Loki's loyalty was conditional, that his word was only as good as his ability to avoid the consequences of breaking it. Yet the treasures he had commissioned through his schemes became some of the most important artifacts in the gods' arsenal, weapons and tools that would prove crucial in the battles to come. His silver tongue might be untrustworthy, his motives suspect, but his results were undeniable. It was this paradox that made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous. An ally whose gifts came wrapped in thorns, and whose solutions created as many problems as they solved. A father of monsters beyond the borders of Asgard, where the light of the gods' golden halls fades into shadow, and the civilized world gives way to the wild places where ancient powers still hold sway. There stretched vast wildernesses, inhabited by beings whose very existence challenged the order that the Jir sought to impose upon the cosmos. It was in these liminal spaces, these borderlands between civilization and chaos, that Loki would forge relationships that would ultimately prove more significant than his brotherhood. With Odin, or his complex dance of loyalty and betrayal with the other gods, in the iron woods of Jotunheim, where trees grew tall as mountains and their leaves whispered secrets older than the world itself, there dwelt a giantess whose beauty was as terrible as it was alluring. Angrboda, the mother of monsters, the bringer of sorrow, whose very name spoke of the grief that follows in the wake of unbridled power. She was ancient when Loki was young, wise in ways that touched upon the fundamental forces of destruction and renewal that governed the cycle of existence. Some say that Loki sought her out deliberately, drawn by rumors of her knowledge and power, her understanding of magics that the gods of Asgard considered too dangerous to explore. Others believe that their meeting was ordained by fate itself, that the Norns, who weave the threads of destiny, had long ago decreed that these two beings, each carrying within them the seeds of cosmic upheaval, should come together and create offspring whose very existence would reshape the 9 realms. Whatever the truth of their first encounter, there was no denying the intensity of the connection that formed between them. In Angrboda, Loki found someone who understood his nature without seeking to change it, who appreciated his cunning without fearing its implications, who could match his shape-shifting abilities with transformations of her own that revealed the fluid nature of identity itself. She saw through his masks and loved what she found beneath them, accepted his contradictions, and embraced the chaos that swirled around him like a perpetual storm. Their union was passionate and terrible, a joining of powers that sent ripples through the fabric of reality itself. The very earth trembled when they came together, and wise seers throughout the 9 realms reported visions of shadows lengthening and ancient barriers weakening. For their love was not merely the meeting of two individuals, but the collision of cosmic forces that had been held in careful balance since the creation of the world. From this union came children whose existence would forever alter the relationship between order and chaos, between the gods and the forces they sought to contain. 3 offspring emerged from Angrboda's womb, each more terrible and wonderful than the last, each carrying within them aspects of their parents' nature, magnified and transformed into something unprecedented in the history of the cosmos. The firstborn was Fenrir, the wolf whose destiny was written in prophecy and blood. Even as a pup, his size and strength were extraordinary, but it was the intelligence that burned in his yellow eyes that truly marked him as no ordinary beast. He could speak with the wisdom of ages, understand the complex political maneuverings of gods and giants, and see through deceptions that might fool beings far more experienced than himself. Yet, for all his wisdom, he was still a wolf at heart, driven by instincts and hungers that no amount of reasoning could fully tame. The gods, recognizing the threat that Fenrir represented, if he were allowed to grow to full maturity in the wild places beyond their control, made the fateful decision to bring him to Asgard and raise him among them. They told themselves it was an act of mercy, a way to civilize the beast, and perhaps earn the loyalty of Loki's son through kindness and fair treatment. But the truth was darker and more complex, for they hoped to keep the wolf where they could watch him, study him, and if necessary, contain him before he became too powerful to handle. Only Tyr, the one-handed god of courage and justice, was brave enough to feed the growing wolf, approaching each day with food and water, while the other gods watched from a safe distance. There was a strange kinship between the god who had sacrificed his sword hand for the good of Asgard and the wolf pup whose own sacrifices were yet to come, a mutual recognition of beings who understood that duty sometimes required accepting terrible prices. As Fenrir grew, so did the gods' fear of what he might become. Prophecies spoke of a wolf who would devour Odin himself at the end of the world. And though the gods tried to dismiss such visions as mere possibilities rather than fixed fate, they could not ignore the way the young wolf's eyes seemed to hold knowledge of futures yet to unfold. His strength increased daily until he could snap iron chains like spider silk and leap distances that defied the very laws of nature. The second child was Jormungandr, the world serpent, whose birth sent shockwaves through the cosmic order itself. Where Fenrir's threat was immediate and obvious, the serpent's danger lay in its potential for growth and its affinity for the primal waters that surrounded and supported all existence. As a hatchling, it was beautiful in its own alien way, its scales shimmering with colors that had no names, and its eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect the very mysteries of creation. But Odin, whose wisdom came from seeing too clearly into the nature of things, recognized that this serpent could not be allowed to remain in Asgard or anywhere near the centers of divine power. With a heavy heart and hands that trembled slightly with the weight of what he was about to do, the Allfather cast the young serpent into the sea that surrounded Midgard, hoping that the vast waters would contain its growth and limit its influence on the affairs of gods and men. What Odin could not have foreseen was how perfectly suited the serpent was to its new environment. Jormungandr thrived in the deep waters, growing at a rate that defied understanding until it became so massive that it could encircle the entire world and grasp its own tail. It lay in the deepest trenches of the ocean, its presence felt as earthquakes and tidal waves, its dreams influencing the very currents that carried ships across the face of the waters. The third child was perhaps the most unsettling of all, for Hel appeared to be neither fully alive nor fully dead, but something caught between states of existence in a way that challenged the fundamental categories by which the gods understood reality. Half of her body was that of a beautiful young woman with skin pale as fresh snow and hair dark as a moonless night, while the other half was corrupted flesh, mottled and decaying, showing the bones and sinews beneath in a display that made even the battle-hardened gods turn away in disgust and pity. Yet there was nothing pitiable about Hel's demeanor or intelligence. She possessed a wisdom that seemed to come from experiencing both life and death simultaneously, understanding the nature of existence from perspectives that no purely living being could comprehend. Her voice carried the authority of one who had seen the end of all things and found it neither terrible nor wonderful, but simply inevitable, recognizing that Hel's nature made her uniquely suited to rule over those who had passed beyond the borders of life. Odin made her queen of the realm of the dead, giving her dominion over all those who died of sickness or old age rather than in glorious battle. It was both an honor and an exile, acknowledging her power while ensuring that she would be contained in a realm where her influence over the living would be limited. But in making these decisions about the fate of Loki's children, the gods planted seeds of resentment that would grow into hatred as deep and enduring as the roots of Yggdrasil itself. They had taken Fenrir from his family and bound him with chains forged from impossible materials and sealed with betrayal. They had cast Jormungandr into exile, forcing the serpent to grow up alone in the cold depths without the guidance or love of its parents. They had given Hel power, but at the cost of eternal separation from the world of warmth and laughter and life. Loki watched these proceedings with eyes that grew steadily colder, his silver tongue falling silent as he witnessed the systematic persecution of his offspring. Each injustice carved itself deeper into his heart, each act of fear-driven cruelty adding another layer to the wall of resentment that was slowly building between him and the gods he had once called family. The playful trickster who had once delighted in harmless mischief was being forged in the fires of paternal rage into something far more dangerous and implacable. And in the depths of ocean and underworld, in the chains of Gleipnir and the halls of Helheim, Loki's children waited and grew strong, their love for their father matched only by their hatred for those who had wronged them all. The seeds of Ragnarok were being watered with tears of separation and fury, growing in darkness toward a day when they would bloom into destruction that would consume gods and mortals alike. When mischief turned to malice. The turning of seasons in Asgard had always been marked by celebration and joy, for each change brought with it new opportunities for the gods to display their power and wisdom, new occasions for feasting and fellowship that strengthened the bonds between the divine family. But as the years passed and Loki's resentment grew like a cancer in his heart, these gatherings began to take on a different character, becoming stages upon which the trickster would perform increasingly elaborate displays of spite and cruelty disguised as entertainment. It was at one such feast, when the golden halls rang with laughter and the mead flowed like honey-sweet rivers, that Loki chose to reveal just how far he had traveled down the path from harmless mischief to calculated malice. The occasion was meant to honor the wisdom and justice of the gods, to celebrate their role as protectors and guides for all the 9 realms. But Loki saw it instead as an opportunity to strip away the masks of nobility and reveal the petty jealousies and hypocrisies that lay beneath their divine facades. With his silver tongue sharpened to a razor's edge and his wit poisoned by years of accumulated grievances, Loki rose from his seat and began to speak. But these were not the clever jokes and amusing stories that had once made him the life of every gathering. Instead, he wove a tapestry of accusations and revelations, exposing secrets that the gods had thought safely buried, revealing affairs and betrayals that had been hidden behind veils of respectability and divine dignity. He spoke of Odin's broken promises and abandoned allies, of the All-Father's willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything in his quest for knowledge and power. He detailed Frigg's attempts to manipulate fate through forbidden magic, her secret alliances with beings that the other gods would consider enemies. He mocked Thor's simple-minded reliance on strength, suggesting that the thunder god's reputation for wisdom was built entirely upon the counsel of others and his own ability to swing a hammer with devastating force. No god was spared from Loki's venom, no reputation left untarnished by his accusations. Some of his words were true, others were lies skillfully woven with enough truth to make them believable, and still others occupied that gray space between fact and fiction where Loki had always been most comfortable. But the accuracy of his statements mattered less than their effect, for each word was chosen to wound. Each revelation calculated to sow discord and distrust among beings who needed unity to face the challenges that lay ahead. The gods sat in stunned silence as Loki's litany of accusations poured forth like poison from a broken chalice, their faces growing pale as secrets they thought safely hidden were dragged into the light of public scrutiny. Some tried to laugh off his words as mere jest, but the laughter sounded forced and hollow in the suddenly cold air of the feast hall. Others attempted to respond with their own accusations, but their voices carried none of Loki's skill or venom, and their words fell flat against the silver-tongued assault that showed no signs of abating. When Thor finally rose to threaten the trickster with physical violence, Loki merely smiled and withdrew, knowing that he had accomplished his purpose. The feast that was meant to celebrate divine unity ended in uncomfortable silence and suspicious glances, with gods who had been friends for millennia suddenly wondering what secrets their companions might be harboring, what betrayals might be hidden behind familiar smiles. But this display of verbal cruelty was merely a prelude to something far more terrible, a demonstration that Loki's transformation from mischievous ally to dangerous enemy was complete. The target of his ultimate act of malice would be the one god who had never spoken, against him who had always defended him before the others, who represented everything that was good and pure in the divine realm of Asgard. Baldr the Beautiful, the shining god whose very presence brought light to the darkest corners of the 9 realms, had become an obsession for Loki in ways that even the trickster himself might not have fully understood. Perhaps it was jealousy of the universal love that Baldr inspired, love that Loki had never received despite all his cleverness and service. Perhaps it was resentment of the younger god's innocence, his ability to see good in everyone, including those who clearly meant him harm. Or perhaps it was something darker and more complex, a need to prove that no one was truly safe from corruption, that even the most perfect being could be brought low by the right application of cunning and malice. Whatever drove him, Loki began to study Baldr with the intensity of a hunter learning the habits of his prey. He observed the younger god's routines, listened to his conversations, and most importantly, paid careful attention to the protective magic that surrounded him like invisible armor. For Frigg, terrified by prophetic dreams that showed her beloved son's death, had traveled throughout the 9 realms, extracting oaths from every living thing that they would never harm Baldr. It was a magnificent working of protective magic, a web of sworn promises that should have made Baldr invulnerable to any weapon or attack. The gods delighted in testing these protections, hurling spears and stones at the shining god, only to watch them swerve away or shatter harmlessly against his divinely protected form. It became a game, a celebration of maternal love and divine power that filled the halls of Asgard with laughter and wonder. But Loki's interest in these displays was not born of admiration or joy. With the patience of a spider waiting at the center of its web, he watched and listened and learned, seeking the flaw that he was certain must exist somewhere in Frigg's elaborate protections. For he understood better than most that absolute perfection was impossible, that every system of defense contained within it the seeds of its own destruction for those clever enough to find them. The breakthrough came through the most innocent of conversations. When Loki approached Frigg, in the guise of an old woman seeking to hear the story of her son's protection, with honeyed words and an appearance of harmless curiosity. He drew from the goddess the admission that there was, indeed, one thing from which she had not extracted an oath. The mistletoe, she explained with a indulgent smile, was too young and harmless to pose any threat, too weak and innocent to require such serious attention. In that moment, Loki felt the terrible satisfaction of a master craftsman who has finally located the single loose thread that will unravel an entire tapestry. He made his excuses and withdrew, his mind already racing with plans for how this information could be transformed into the instrument of his revenge against the gods who had wronged him and his children. The creation of the mistletoe dart required all of Loki's skill and cunning, for he needed to craft not just a physical weapon, but a psychological trap that would ensure maximum devastation. He carved the dart with his own hands, imbuing it with malice and sharpening it to a point that could penetrate even divine flesh. But the weapon itself was only part of his plan, for he needed someone else to wield it, someone whose involvement would multiply the tragedy and ensure that the wound cut deeper than mere physical harm. His choice fell upon Baldr's own brother, the blind god whose gentle nature and love for his sibling made him the perfect, unwitting instrument of fratricide. Approaching HR during one of the gods' games of testing Baldr's invulnerability, Loki offered to help the blind god participate in the fun by guiding his aim and providing him with a suitable projectile. The dart flew true, guided by Loki's steady hand and powered by hatred that had been building for years like pressure in a sealed vessel. It struck Baldr in the chest with a sound like breaking crystal, and the shining god fell without a cry, his light fading from his eyes as death claimed him despite all the protections that should have kept him safe. The laughter in Asgard's halls died as if cut off by a blade, replaced by a silence so profound that it seemed to echo through all the 9 realms. The gods' grief was a terrible thing to witness, their anguish so pure and overwhelming that it shook the very foundations of reality. Frigg's wails could be heard from the deepest caves to the highest mountain peaks, while Odin sat in stunned silence, his ravens bringing him news of disturbances throughout the cosmos as the natural order reacted to the death of one who had been its brightest ornament. But it was not merely grief that filled the gods' hearts as they realized the true nature of what had occurred. The recognition that Loki had orchestrated this tragedy, that he had used their own love and trust as weapons against them, transformed their sorrow into a cold fury that burned hotter than the fires of Muspelheim. For they understood that this was not simply the death of their beloved Baldr, but the beginning of something far worse, the first crack in the foundation that would eventually bring down everything they had built. Yet, even as they planned their revenge against the trickster, who had betrayed them so completely, they could not escape the terrible knowledge that they themselves bore some responsibility for what had happened. Their treatment of Loki's children, their casual cruelties and thoughtless prejudices, their failure to see the pain that was building behind his charming smile, all of these things had contributed to the tragedy that now consumed them. The bright halls of Asgard would never again ring with the same innocent laughter, for the gods had learned that evil could emerge from within their own ranks, that betrayal could wear a familiar face and speak with a trusted voice. The age of innocence was ending, and the twilight of the gods had begun with the flight of a single mistletoe dart, guided by a hand they had thought friendly, bound in darkness. The capture of Loki was not accomplished through strength of arms or superior numbers. For the shapeshifter's cunning and ability to transform himself into any creature made him nearly impossible to corner through conventional means. Instead, it required a trap as elaborate and carefully planned as any of his own schemes, one that used his own nature against him and exploited the very bonds of family that he both cherished and corrupted throughout his long and troubled existence. When the gods finally understood the full scope of Loki's betrayal, when they realized that the death of Baldr was not an isolated act of malice, but the culmination of years of growing resentment and carefully planned revenge, their pursuit of the trickster became relentless. Led by Odin's ravens and guided by the Allfather's supernatural sight, they scoured the 9 realms, seeking the one who had shattered their divine family and brought darkness to the golden halls of Asgard. Loki, sensing the net closing around him, fled to the wilderness beyond the borders of civilization, 2 places where the old magics still held sway and the landscape itself could be bent to serve the needs of those who understood its hidden nature. In a cottage beside a rushing waterfall, he made his temporary refuge, using his shapeshifting abilities to take the form of a salmon. Whenever danger approached, diving deep into the clear waters where even Odin's sight could not easily follow. But isolation and constant fear began to work changes in the trickster's mind, wearing away at the silver tongue and quick wit that had always been his greatest weapons. Long hours spent in fish form, thinking simple thoughts and following ancient instincts, began to blur the boundaries of his identity in ways that frightened even him. He found himself forgetting important details of his plans, losing track of time as he swam in endless circles through water that grew colder with each passing day. It was during one of these periods of confused metamorphosis that the gods finally cornered their quarry. Using nets woven from the most cunningly designed patterns, employing techniques that Loki himself had inadvertently taught them during his years of service, they managed to capture the salmon that had once been the silver-tongued god of mischief and lies. The transformation back to his original form was agonizing, his flesh seeming to resist returning to its proper shape, as if it had grown comfortable in the simpler existence of a fish. The trial that followed was less a legal proceeding than a ceremony of banishment, a ritual designed to formally sever the bonds that had once made Loki part of the divine family of Asgard. Odin, his face carved from stone, and his single eye blazing with fury that had been building for decades, pronounced judgment not just on the trickster's recent crimes, but on all the accumulated betrayals and cruelties that had led to this moment. But the gods' revenge would not be satisfied with mere exile or even death, for they understood that Loki's cunning and supernatural nature made him too dangerous to be allowed any chance of escape or return. They required a punishment that would be both permanent and appropriate to the magnitude of his crimes, one that would ensure he could never again threaten the peace and safety of their realm. The choice of location for Loki's eternal prison was itself an act of cruel symbolism. Deep beneath the earth in caverns where no light had ever penetrated, and the very air seemed heavy with the weight of accumulated sorrow, they found a place where the trickster could be bound with chains that would hold not just his body, but his very essence. Here, surrounded by dripping stone and eternal darkness, Loki would have endless time to contemplate the consequences of his actions. The chains themselves were forged not from ordinary metal, but from the bonds of kinship and blood that Loki had so thoroughly corrupted. In a display of justice so terrible that even the gods who decreed it felt sickened by its necessity. They took Loki's own sons, transformed one into a wolf that tore apart his brother, and then used the victim's entrails to bind their father to the rocky walls of his prison. The symbolism was inescapable. Loki would be held forever by the very family bonds he had twisted and betrayed. But even this was not the full extent of his punishment. Above his bound form, the gods positioned a serpent whose venom would drip eternally onto his face, each drop burning like liquid fire and causing agony that would never diminish or fade. The pain was designed to be unendurable, yet inescapable, a constant reminder of the suffering he had inflicted on others throughout his long career of mischief and malice. Only one figure remained constant in this scene of eternal torment, a presence that transformed the punishment from mere cruelty into something approaching tragedy. Sigyn, Loki's faithful wife, chose to remain by her husband's side despite all his crimes and betrayals, holding a bowl to catch the serpent's venom and spare him what pain she could. Her devotion was both touching and terrible, a reminder that even the most corrupted being could inspire love in at least one heart. Yet even Sigyn's dedication had its limits. When the bowl filled with venom and she was forced to turn away to empty it, the drops that fell upon Loki's face caused him to writhe in such agony that his movements shook the very foundations of the earth. These tremors felt throughout the 9 realms as earthquakes that toppled mountains and split the ground, served as a constant reminder to gods and mortals alike that the trickster's suffering continued, that justice was being served even in the deepest places where no eye could witness it. The gods who had decreed this punishment told themselves that it was necessary, that someone who had committed such terrible crimes deserved no mercy or hope of redemption. But in the quiet moments, when they thought no one was watching, some of them looked troubled, as if they wondered whether their justice had crossed the line into vengeance, whether their response to Loki's cruelty had made them cruel in turn. For in binding Loki with such elaborate and symbolic torments, they had revealed something about their own nature that was perhaps more disturbing than anything the trickster had ever done. They had shown that gods, no less than mortals, could be driven by hatred, and deep in his cavern prison, writhing in eternal agony yet still possessed of the intelligence that had once made him the cleverest being in all the 9 realms, Loki waited and planned and nursed his hatred until it grew into something that transcended personal grievance and became a force of cosmic destruction. The chains that bound his body could not hold his mind, and in the endless darkness between the drops of venom, he dreamed of the day when his suffering would end and his revenge would begin in earnest. The gods had thought to solve the problem of Loki by removing him from the equation, but they had succeeded only in creating an enemy whose hatred burned with the intensity of a star about to go supernova. In their prison of stone and serpent venom, they had forged the architect of their own destruction, and the countdown to Ragnarok had begun with the sound of chains rattling in the darkness and the earth trembling with divine agony. The shadow of Ragnarok, in the deepest places of prophecy and dream, where the Norns weave the threads of fate with fingers that have known every sorrow and every joy that will ever be the end of all things, is written in letters of fire and shadow. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle that will consume not just Asgard, but all the 9 realms in flames that burn cold as the heart of winter and hot as the fury of betrayed love. It is an ending that is also a beginning, a destruction that carries within it the seeds of renewal, and at its center stands the bound figure of Loki, no longer the silver-tongued trickster, but something far more terrible and implacable. The signs of the approaching end times had been accumulating for years, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced as the cosmic order began to unravel under the weight of accumulated injustices and unpaid debts. Seasons became erratic, with winters that lasted for years and summers that brought no warmth to the frozen earth. Brother turned against brother as the bonds of kinship weakened and the social fabric that held communities together began to fray like old rope under too much strain. The very wolves grew bold enough to hunt in broad daylight, and the dead were seen walking among the living, their presence a reminder that the boundaries between life and death were becoming permeable. But these were merely the overture to the symphony of destruction that would begin when Loki finally broke free from his eternal prison. The earthquake that would herald his escape would be different from all the others, not merely the writhing of a bound god in pain, but the purposeful movement of a being who had finally accumulated enough power and hatred to shatter the chains that held him. The sound of breaking stone and snapping bonds would echo through all the realms, like the tolling of a bell that announces the death of kings. When Loki emerged from his cavern prison, those who saw him would barely recognize the figure that had once charmed the halls of Asgard with wit and clever stories. The years of torture had burned away everything soft and human in his nature, leaving behind something that was pure will and concentrated malice, a being whose very presence warped reality around him like heat distortion rising from sun-baked stone. His eyes held the cold fire of distant stars, and his smile carried the promise of endings that would make even the bravest heroes weep with despair. The first beings to answer his call would be his own children, the monsters that the gods had scattered and imprisoned in their fear and short-sightedness. From the depths of the ocean would rise Jormungandr, the world serpent, grown so massive in the years of exile that his movements would cause tidal waves that could drown entire continents. His venom would poison the very air, creating clouds of toxic mist that would choke the life from any living thing they touched. From the realm of the dead would march the armies of hell, led by the goddess whose half-living, half-dead nature made her the perfect general for forces that existed in the spaces between life and death. Her soldiers would be the dishonored dead, those who had died not in glorious battle, but from sickness and old age and accident. Their ghostly forms, driven by resentment at being denied the warrior's paradise of Valhalla. They would march beneath banners made from funeral shrouds, their weapons forged from the bones of those they had been in life. And from the place where the gods had thought him safely bound would come Fenrir, the wolf whose chains would finally prove insufficient to hold his divine strength and burning need for revenge. Grown to the size of a small mountain, with jaws that could swallow the sun and eyes that burned with intelligence older than the world itself, he would lead the charge against Asgard with a howl that would shatter windows in all the 9 realms, and strike terror into hearts that had never known fear. But Loki's army would not consist only of his own offspring and their followers. The giants, those ancient enemies of the gods, who had never forgotten the slights and injuries they had suffered at divine hands, would rally to his banner in numbers that would darken the sky like a plague of locusts. Led by Surtur, the fire giant, whose flaming sword had been forged in the first moments of creation, they would march from Muspelheim with the heat of dying stars surrounding them like an aura of inevitable destruction. The final battle would take place on the plain of Vigrid, forces that would clash above the heads of the individual warriors. Here, the gods would make their last stand, summoned from Valhalla and by the sound of Heimdall's horn, calling them to face their destiny with whatever courage they could muster. Odin, the Allfather, would ride at the head of the divine army, mounted on Sleipnir, his 8-legged steed, born from Loki's own transformation and trickery years before. The irony would not be lost on either the rider or the horse, for even Odin's mount was tainted by connection to the very enemy he rode to face. Gungnir, the unerring spear, crafted by dwarven hands through Loki's manipulation, would gleam in the twilight as if aware that it was about to fulfill its ultimate purpose. Thor would stride into battle, with Mjolnir singing through the air around him, the hammer that had been shortened by Loki's interference now seeming perfectly balanced for the work ahead. His red beard would be braided with lightning, and his eyes would hold the fury of every storm that had ever raged across the sky. Yet even the thunder god, mightiest of warriors, would face an opponent whose power had grown beyond all mortal comprehension. The individual duels that would decide the fate of the cosmos had been foretold since the beginning of time, written into the very structure of reality by forces too ancient and vast to fully understand. Odin would face Fenrir in single combat, the Allfather's wisdom and experience pitted against the wolf's supernatural strength and burning desire for revenge. The battle would rage across the sky itself, shaking the very pillars that held up the heavens, until finally the wolf's jaws would close around the god who had ordered his binding, ending the reign of the wisest of the Gear in a moment of cosmic justice that was also cosmic tragedy. Thor's opponent would be Jormungandr, the world serpent that he had been destined to face since the moment of its birth. Their battle would be titanic, the thunder god's hammer striking sparks from the serpent's scales, while its coils threatened to crush entire mountains in their writhing. In the end, Thor would succeed in slaying the monster that had been his destined enemy, but the victory would come at the ultimate price, for the serpent's dying breath would fill the air with venom so potent that even divine constitution could not resist its effects. But it would be the duel between Loki and Heimdall that would carry the deepest significance, for these two had been enemies since the beginning of their association. The far-seeing guardian and the shape-shifting deceiver, locked in a conflict that transcended personal animosity and became a clash between fundamental principles of order and chaos. Their battle would be fought not just with weapons, but with the very forces they embodied, each seeking to unmake the other on levels that touched the basic structure of reality itself. When the dust settled and the last blows had been struck, both would lie dead upon the field of battle, their mutual destruction serving as a symbol of the price that such cosmic conflicts demand. For in the end, there could be no true victors in a war that pitted the forces of existence against themselves. No triumph that did not carry within it the seeds of its own negation. Yet from the ashes of this ultimate destruction would come renewal, for the Norse understanding of endings was always paired with the promise of new beginnings. The few gods who survived the battle would gather the scattered remnants of the world and begin the work of rebuilding, while from hiding places they had prepared in advance, a few humans would emerge to repopulate the earth and carry forward the essential spark of consciousness that would ensure continuity between the old world and the new. The sun, devoured by wolves during the battle, would be replaced by her daughter, whose light would be even brighter and more beautiful than that which had been lost. New gods would be born or would emerge from their own hiding places, carrying with them wisdom gained from witnessing the destruction of the old order and the determination to build something better from its ruins. But even in this renewal, Loki's influence would continue, for the new world would be shaped by the memory of what had been lost and the understanding of how easily order could slip into chaos if vigilance were relaxed or justice perverted into vengeance. His story would serve as both warning and reminder, a tale told around fires in the long northern nights, to help future generations understand the terrible price of betrayal and the complex nature of beings who could be both creator and destroyer, savior and enemy, all wrapped up in a single, impossibly contradictory existence. Reflections beneath the stars. As the great wheel of time turns through its final revolution, and the echoes of Ragnarok fade into the silence that follows all endings, we find ourselves once again beneath the northern sky, where stars wheel overhead in patterns that have remained unchanged since the beginning of the world. The aurora still dances across the heavens, painting the darkness in colors that have no earthly names, and in that ethereal light we see reflected all the beauty and terror of the story that has unfolded before us, like a dream that is both nightmare and revelation. The tale of Loki that we have followed through its long and winding path from mischievous trickster to cosmic destroyer is more than simply the biography of a single god, more than just another myth to be catalogued among the countless stories that humanity has told itself in its endless quest to understand the nature of existence. It is a mirror held up to the fundamental contradictions that lie at the heart of consciousness itself, an exploration of the thin lines that separate love from hate, creation from destruction, wisdom from folly. In Loki, the Norse found a way to give voice to all the uncomfortable truths that more sanitized mythologies prefer to ignore or gloss over with reassuring platitudes. He represents the acknowledgement that every act of creation contains within it the potential for destruction, that every moment of joy carries the shadow of future sorrow, that every bond of love or friendship or family ties can become a chain that binds us to obligations we may come to resent or fear. The gods of Asgard, for all their wisdom and power, were ultimately undone, not by external enemies or cosmic forces beyond their control, but by their own inability to fully understand or accept the nature of the being they had welcomed into their midst. They loved Loki for his cleverness and his ability to solve problems that defeated their straightforward approaches, but they never truly trusted him or made him feel that he belonged among them as an equal, rather than a useful outsider whose loyalty was always contingent and conditional. Their treatment of his children reveals the deepest tragedy of the entire cycle. For in allowing their fear of prophecy to override their commitment to justice and mercy, they created the very enemies they sought to prevent. Fenrir might have remained a loyal friend to the gods if they had shown him the trust and respect that his intelligence and noble nature deserved. Jormungandr could have been a guardian of the seas rather than their poisoner. If he had been raised with love instead of cast into exile, Hel might have been a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead rather than a ruler who hoarded souls in her cold kingdom. But perhaps the most profound insight that Loki's story offers is its recognition that the capacity for both good and evil exists within every conscious being, that the line between hero and villain is often thinner than we would like to believe. Loki began his career among the gods as a genuinely helpful figure, using his gifts to benefit Asgard and its inhabitants. solving problems and creating wonders that improved the lives of those around him. His transformation into the architect of divine destruction was not the result of some inherent evil nature, but the gradual accumulation of slights and injustices, each small betrayal adding another layer to the wall of resentment that eventually grew tall enough to block out all light and warmth. The Norse, those hardy people who lived their lives in the shadow of harsh winters and uncertain harvests, understood better than most that existence was a precarious balance between order and chaos, that civilization was a thin veneer stretched over depths that could swallow the unwary without warning. They knew that the forces that brought them warmth and light were the same ones that could burn down their homes, that the strength that protected them from enemies could just as easily be turned against them by friends whose loyalty had curdled into hatred. This understanding permeates every aspect of Loki's story, from his earliest pranks to his final act of cosmic destruction. Each trick he plays reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of the gods who are its target. Each solution he provides comes with hidden costs that only become apparent when the bill comes due. He serves as a constant reminder that no system is perfect, no authority figure beyond corruption, no bond strong enough to survive every test that time and circumstance can devise. Yet, for all the darkness that surrounds his tale, there is something oddly comforting about Loki's presence in the Norse pantheon, in a mythology filled with gods who are paragons of various virtues. He stands as acknowledgement that flawed beings can still play crucial roles in the great drama of existence. His very contradictions make him more human than his more noble companions, his struggles with identity and belonging more relatable than their serene confidence in their roles and purposes. The fact that the Norse chose to preserve his story, to continue telling it even after Christianity had officially replaced their old beliefs, suggests that they found in it something essential that could not be replaced by more conventional tales of good triumphing over evil. Perhaps they recognized that Loki represented aspects of themselves that they could not afford to ignore or deny, the parts of human nature that were capable of both great creativity and terrible destruction, often simultaneously. In our own age, when the certainties that once seemed to provide solid foundations for belief and action have been shaken by the recognition of how complex and ambiguous moral questions can be, Loki's story seems more relevant than ever. He speaks to everyone who has ever felt like an outsider, everyone who has ever used humor to mask pain or intelligence to justify actions they later regretted. He embodies the modern understanding that identity is fluid rather than fixed, that the stories we tell about ourselves can become prisons just as easily as they can become sources of strength. As we sit beneath these ancient stars and contemplate the tale that has wound its way through darkness and light to reach this moment of reflection, we might ask ourselves what lessons we can draw from Loki's long journey from beloved trickster to cosmic destroyer and back to something approaching understanding. Perhaps the most important insight is that every ending contains within it the seeds of new beginnings, that even the most complete destruction leaves behind materials that can be used to build something better. The new world that emerges from the ashes of Ragnarok is not simply a restoration of what was lost, but something genuinely different, informed by the hard-won wisdom that comes from witnessing the consequences of old mistakes and ancient injustices. The gods who survive the final battle carry with them the memory of what went wrong the first time. The knowledge of how easily good intentions can be corrupted by fear, and how quickly justice can transform into vengeance when those who wield it lose sight of their higher purposes. In this sense, Loki's story is ultimately hopeful despite all its darkness, for it suggests that even the most terrible mistakes can serve as teachers if we have the courage to look honestly at their lessons. The trickster's long fall from grace serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing resentment to poison our relationships and our judgment. But it also demonstrates the terrible consequences that can follow when communities fail to address the legitimate grievances of their members. The Northern Lights continue their ancient dance overhead, painting the sky in colors that shift and change like the emotions that have colored our journey through this most complex of mythological tales. In their flickering radiance, we see reflected all the contradictions and complexities that make Loki's story so enduringly powerful, so resistant to simple moral categorization. For, in the end, the tale of the trickster god is not really about gods at all, but about us, about the struggles we all face in trying to find our place in communities that both need and fear. Our unique gifts about the choices we make when we feel rejected or misunderstood, about the prices we pay for the masks we wear and the roles we play in the great drama of existence. As the night deepens around us and the stars wheel through their ancient patterns, we carry with us the memory of Loki's laughter and tears, his triumphs and failures, his love and his hatred. They become part of our own story, woven into the fabric of our understanding, like threads in a tapestry that is still being completed, still being transformed by each new telling and each new listener who finds in these ancient words some echo of their own deepest truths and most profound mysteries. The wind carries with it the scent of pine and snow, of distant fires, and the salt spray of northern seas, and in that familiar perfume of the wild places, we smell the essence of stories that will never truly end. Tales that will continue to be told as long as consciousness persists and beings gather together to share the burden and the wonder of trying to understand what it means to exist in a universe that is both beautiful and terrible, both meaningful and absurd, both ordered and chaotic all at once. In the silence that follows the ending of tales, in the space between the last word and the return to ordinary time, we rest in the knowledge that some stories are too large and too complex to ever be fully told, too deep and too nuanced to ever be completely understood. Loki's tale is one of these, a myth that reveals new facets each time we turn it toward the light, a mirror that shows us different aspects of ourselves, depending on the angle from which we choose to look. And perhaps that is the greatest gift that the silver-tongued trickster has left us, this recognition that truth is not singular but multiple, that wisdom comes not from finding simple answers, but from learning to live comfortably with complex questions, and that even in the darkest tales there can be found threads of light that lead us toward deeper understanding of ourselves and the strange and wonderful universe we inhabit. The stars continue their eternal watch overhead, silent witnesses to all the stories that have been told beneath their light, and all the stories yet to come, and in their distant radiance we find the promise that no tale is ever truly finished, no mystery ever completely solved, no journey ever definitively ended. There will always be new paths to explore, new questions to ask, new ways of understanding the ancient truths that connect us all in the great web of existence, that stretches from the smallest grain of sand to the most distant star, from the simplest laugh to the most complex sorrow, from the beginning of time to whatever lies beyond the end of all things.